The moment you stop explaining yourself, certain people will disappear. And that's how you know you're healing. Over-explaining is often mistaken for clarity, maturity, or emotional intelligence, but at its core it is rarely a virtue. It is a survival strategy formed in an environment where being misunderstood carried consequences. Long before it became a habit, it was a defense. The psyche learned that safety depended on being clear, convincing, gentle, and exhaustive, not because truth required it, but because acceptance did. The impulse to over-explain does not come from confidence. It comes from the fear that silence will be interpreted as guilt, arrogance, or rejection. Somewhere in the past, silence was not neutral. Silence was dangerous. It invited punishment, withdrawal, or emotional abandonment. So the mind adapted. It learned to anticipate misunderstanding before it even occurred. It learned to narrate itself in advance, to preempt rejection by removing all ambiguity. This is why over-explaining carries urgency. There is a subtle anxiety beneath it, a sense that if the other person does not fully grasp every motive, tone, and intention, something terrible will happen. The relationship will rupture. The connection will be lost. Love will be withdrawn. The nervous system does not experience misunderstanding as a simple difference in perspective. It experiences it as a threat. In early life, many people were not allowed to simply be. Their emotions were questioned, minimized, or distorted. They were told they were too sensitive, overreacting, or misremembering. To survive psychologically, they learned to build airtight cases for their inner reality. They explained not to be heard, but to be believed. Over time, this habit solidified into identity. They became the one who clarifies, smooths, reassures, and justifies. But what looks like communication is often self-betrayal. Over-explaining subtly places the other person in the position of judge. It assumes they are entitled to an explanation. It hands them authority over whether your experience is valid. Each extra sentence is not about clarity, but about proving innocence in a trial that was never fair to begin with. Healthy communication is reciprocal. Over-explaining is unilateral. One person speaks. The other evaluates. One performs emotional labor. The other consumes it. This imbalance is the signature of trauma, not virtue. The psyche is still operating under an old rule. Connection must be earned through effort, not assumed through mutual respect. Notice who triggers your over-explaining. It is rarely safe people. It is not those who listen openly or respond with curiosity. It is those who are dismissive, emotionally vague, or subtly accusatory. The body senses the familiar pattern and activates the old strategy. Explain more, soften more, justify more. If you do it well enough, maybe this time you won't be abandoned. But a regulated nervous system does not over-explain. It states, it allows space, it tolerates misunderstanding without collapsing. It knows that being misinterpreted is not the same as being invalidated. A healed psyche understands a crucial distinction. Not everyone who misunderstands you deserves access to further explanation. Over-explaining also hides anger. Beneath the excessive clarification is often a rage that was never allowed to exist. Instead of saying, "This crossed a line," the wounded empath explains why it hurt. Instead of setting a boundary, they offer context. Instead of expressing anger, they translate it into palatable language. This keeps relationships superficially intact while eroding the self from within. The transformation begins when you stop seeing explanation as moral. Silence does not mean you are wrong. Brevity does not mean you are cruel. Letting someone sit with their discomfort does not make you unkind. It makes you differentiated. When you no longer feel compelled to narrate your inner world to be safe, something fundamental has shifted in the psyche. Over-explaining fades when self-trust replaces self-defense. When you believe your experience does not need external validation to be real, when you accept that some people will misunderstand you no matter how clearly you speak, and when you realize that those who demand excessive explanation are often revealing their own inability to tolerate boundaries, ambiguity, or autonomy, chasing rarely begins as desire. It begins as alarm, a subtle internal signal that something essential is about to be lost. The psyche interprets distance not as space, but as danger. What looks like longing on the surface is often a nervous system scrambling to prevent a familiar wound from reopening. Chasing is not about wanting more of someone. It is about not wanting to be left. The impulse to chase emerges when connection becomes unstable. A delayed response, a shift in tone, a withdrawal of warmth. For someone with an integrated sense of self, these moments register as information. For someone carrying unresolved abandonment, they register as threat. The body responds before the mind can reason. Anxiety rises, focus narrows. The other person becomes the emotional center of gravity. Attention locks in not because love deepened, but because fear was activated. This is why chasing intensifies with emotionally unavailable people. Their inconsistency mirrors an early relational environment where care was unpredictable. The psyche recognizes the pattern and mistakes it for chemistry. What is actually happening is repetition compulsion. The mind unconsciously seeks to resolve an old injury by recreating it, hoping this time it will end differently. If you can just be more patient, more understanding, more present, perhaps the person will stay. Perhaps you will finally be chosen. Chasing is fueled by the belief that connection must be maintained through effort. That if you relax, you will be forgotten. That desire is fragile and must be constantly stimulated. This belief forms when love was conditional. When affection appeared only after performance, compliance, or emotional labor, the adult psyche inherits this logic and applies it to intimacy. It does not wait to be met. It pursues. It overextends. It moves toward before being invited. What makes chasing so deceptive is that it often wears the mask of devotion. It feels noble to fight for connection, to not give up easily, to be the one who cares more. But beneath this narrative is a quieter truth. Chasing collapses self-respect. Each step towards someone who is not stepping toward you reinforces the idea that your presence alone is insufficient, that you must add urgency, explanation, or sacrifice to deserve reciprocity. There is also a loss of perception in chasing. The more you pursue, the less clearly you see. Red flags soften. Mixed signals are reinterpreted as complexity. Absence is framed as business. Disinterest is translated into fear of intimacy. The psyche protects the attachment by distorting reality. It would rather deny what is happening than face the grief of acknowledging what is not. At its core, chasing is an attempt to regulate emotional pain externally. Instead of tolerating the discomfort of uncertainty or loss, the mind seeks relief through action. Send a message. Reopen the conversation. Offer reassurance. Do something. Anything that restores a sense of connection, even temporarily. This creates a cycle where short-term relief reinforces long-term imbalance. The nervous system learns that anxiety can be quieted by pursuit, but the cost is self abandonment. A healed psyche does not chase because it no longer equates distance with danger. It understands that absence can mean many things, and none of them require self-erasure. It can sit with the unease of not knowing. It can allow another person to reveal themselves through their actions without intervening. It trusts that what is mutual does not need to be forced into existence. When chasing stops, grief often surfaces. The grief of recognizing how much energy was spent trying to be chosen. The grief of seeing how many times effort replaced reciprocity. This grief is necessary. It marks the moment the psyche stops reenacting the old wound and begins to mourn it instead. Only what is mourned can be released. The shadow of abandonment loses its power when the self becomes a secure base. When validation is no longer outsourced. When worth is not negotiated through pursuit. The desire to chase fades, not because love disappears, but because fear no longer leads the movement. What remains is clarity, interest that moves both ways, presence that does not require pursuit, connection that arrives without pursuit and stays without persuasion. Endless forgiveness is often praised as moral superiority, emotional maturity, or spiritual evolution, but beneath its polished surface it can function as a sophisticated form of self-betrayal. When forgiveness becomes automatic, reflexive, and disconnected from accountability, it stops being an act of wisdom and becomes an act of avoidance. It avoids conflict, avoids loss, and most importantly, avoids the pain of acknowledging that someone has chosen to harm, disregard, or exploit you. The compulsion to forgive endlessly is rarely born from strength. More often, it is shaped in environments where anger was unsafe and boundaries were punished. The psyche learned that staying connected required minimizing harm and restoring harmony at any cost. To survive, it reframed violation as misunderstanding and betrayal as imperfection. Forgiveness became a way to maintain attachment, not as a reflection of inner peace. This pattern is especially common in people who were taught that love is conditional upon tolerance. They learned that saying no led to withdrawal and expressing anger led to rejection. Over time, forgiveness became a strategy to preserve belonging. Not forgiving felt dangerous, even immoral. The self was trained to absorb harm quietly, believing that endurance equaled virtue. But forgiveness without integration fractures the psyche. Each time harm is excused without being metabolized, a split occurs. One part of the self moves on, while another remains frozen at the moment of violation. This is why endlessly forgiving people often feel numb, resentful, or depleted despite believing they are doing the right thing. The body remembers what the mind insists on releasing prematurely. Endless forgiveness also distorts power dynamics. It removes consequence. It teaches others that access to you is unconditional regardless of behavior. When forgiveness is given without change, it does not heal relationships, it enables repetition. The offender learns that remorse is optional and repair is unnecessary. The forgiver learns that their pain has no weight. This is where forgiveness becomes self-abandonment. Instead of honoring the injury, the empath bypasses it. Instead of allowing anger to clarify boundaries, they suppress it in the name of compassion. Anger, when integrated, is not destructive. It is information. It signals violation. It marks limits. When anger is denied, boundaries collapse, and the psyche compensates by over-giving. True forgiveness is not an erasure of memory. It is a reorganization of meaning. It requires that the harm be fully acknowledged, that responsibility be clearly assigned, and that the self be protected from recurrence. Without these elements, forgiveness is not healing, it is dissociation dressed as grace. There is also a subtle identity attachment to endless forgiveness. Being the one who forgives becomes a way to feel morally superior, indispensable, or spiritually advanced. This identity can be difficult to relinquish because it offers a sense of purpose, but it comes at a cost. It attracts people who are comfortable being forgiven and the uncomfortable being accountable. A healed psyche understands that forgiveness is not owed, it is chosen. And sometimes the most compassionate choice is distance. Forgiving internally does not require reconciliation externally. You can release hatred without reopening access. You can let go of resentment without inviting repetition. When forgiveness is integrated rather than compulsive, it arrives slowly. It waits for truth. It honors anger before transcending it. It does not rush to restore peace at the expense of self-respect. It understands that some relationships end not because forgiveness was withheld, but because respect never existed. The moment endless forgiveness ends, guilt often appears. The old conditioning whispers that you are cruel, unforgiving, or hardened. But this guilt is not conscience. It is withdrawal from an identity built around self-sacrifice. As that identity dissolves, something more stable emerges: self-trust, the trust that your pain matters, the trust that love does not require erasure, the trust that boundaries are not punishment, but clarity. Healing is often imagined as becoming softer, gentler, and endlessly understanding, but this image is incomplete. True healing does not weaken the psyche, it integrates it. It brings together what was split apart for survival: tenderness and strength, sensitivity and authority, compassion and power. When power is excluded in the name of goodness, compassion becomes fragile. When compassion is excluded in the pursuit of power, strength becomes destructive. Integration is the only resolution. Many people were conditioned to believe that power and compassion are opposites. Early environments taught them that being strong meant being cold, dominant, or cruel, while being compassionate meant being passive, self-sacrificing, or compliant. To remain safe and loved, they chose compassion and disowned power. Assertiveness was labeled selfish. Anger was seen as dangerous. Boundaries were interpreted as rejection. The psyche adapted by becoming agreeable and over-accommodating. This split creates an internal imbalance. Compassion without power leads to chronic self-neglect. The individual feels responsible for others' emotions while feeling disconnected from their own needs. They absorb pain without protest and call it empathy. Over time, this produces exhaustion, resentment, and a quiet sense of invisibility. The psyche gives and gives, but nothing in it feels protected. Power without compassion creates a different wound. It hardens the personality. It prioritizes control over connection and dominance over understanding. This often develops in response to betrayal or prolonged vulnerability. The individual learns that softness invites harm, so they armor themselves. While they may appear confident or unbothered, their strength is rigid rather than grounded. It lacks flexibility and intimacy. Healing does not choose between these extremes. It integrates them. Integration means reclaiming power without abandoning compassion. It means allowing sensitivity to coexist with boundaries. The healed psyche can feel deeply without losing itself. It can assert limits without cruelty. This balance is not learned intellectually, it is embodied through experience. When power is integrated, compassion changes form. It is no longer compulsive. It is no longer offered to avoid conflict or earn love. It becomes selective. The healed individual can say no without guilt, and yes without self-betrayal. Compassion is extended freely, but not indiscriminately. It flows from abundance rather than fear. Anger plays a critical role in this integration. Anger is often misunderstood as aggression, but at its core, it is a boundary emotion. It signals that something matters and has been crossed. When anger is suppressed, power is suppressed with it. Healing requires learning to feel anger without acting it out destructively. When anger is integrated, it sharpens discernment and protects what is vulnerable. This is why healed individuals often appear less accommodating than before. They are not less kind, they are less available to disrespect. Their compassion no longer overrides their instincts. They listen to discomfort as information rather than something to override. Power gives compassion a spine. Integrated power also changes how one relates to responsibility. The healed psyche no longer assumes responsibility for everyone else's emotions. It recognizes where its influence ends. This does not reduce care, it prevents enmeshment. Compassion becomes clean, not entangled. Support is offered without control, and care is given without rescue. This integration also dissolves the need to prove goodness. When power was disarmed, compassion became performative. It needed to be seen and validated. With integration, there is no need to demonstrate kindness. It is felt internally as alignment. Power provides an inner anchor that makes external approval unnecessary. Healing, then, is not about becoming harmless. It is about becoming whole. Wholeness includes the capacity to protect, to confront, to withdraw, and to stand firm. Compassion without power is unsustainable. Power without compassion is isolating. When they merge, the psyche becomes resilient. It can engage with the world without losing itself and care, without collapsing into it. Silence is often misunderstood as absence, weakness, or withdrawal, but in psychological terms, it is one of the most advanced expressions of integration. Silence does not mean nothing is happening. It means nothing needs to be defended, explained, or proven. When the psyche reaches a state of wholeness, it no longer relies on noise to establish reality. It rests in itself. In early development, language is used to secure connection. Words become tools for reassurance, negotiation, and survival. The child learns to speak not only to express, but to regulate the emotional environment. Explaining, apologizing, and clarifying become ways to manage others' reactions. When safety is inconsistent, silence feels dangerous. It risks misunderstanding, rejection, or punishment. So the psyche fills the space with words. As long as the self is fragmented, silence is intolerable. It creates a vacuum where doubt rushes in. The mind assumes that if it does not narrate its intentions, others will misinterpret them. If it does not explain its pain, it will not be believed. Speech becomes armor. Constant articulation becomes a way to hold the self together. Wholeness changes this relationship. When the psyche integrates, it no longer experiences itself as precarious. It does not require continuous external affirmation to feel real. Silence becomes neutral, even nourishing. The individual can allow pauses without rushing to fill them. They can let misunderstandings exist without scrambling to correct them. Their sense of self does not fracture in the absence of explanation. This is why silence often emerges after deep healing, not as avoidance, but as clarity. The healed individual has already confronted their inner chaos. They have spoken the truths that mattered internally. They have grieved, raged, reflected, and reorganized, when they re-enter the world, they no longer need to verbalize every internal process. What remains is presence. Silence also signals the end of unconscious negotiation. Much of ordinary speech is not about communication, but about positioning. We speak to be liked, to be safe, to be chosen, to avoid conflict. When these motives dissolve, speech becomes intentional rather than compulsive. The healed psyche does not speak to manage perception. It speaks only when expression adds value. There is power in this restraint. Silence creates boundaries without confrontation. It withdraws energy from dynamics that feed on reaction. It communicates finality without aggression. For those accustomed to emotional access, silence can feel unsettling. It removes the familiar cues they use to engage, manipulate, or extract reassurance. This is why silence is often interpreted as punishment when it is actually self-regulation. Silence is also an act of trust. Trust in one's own experience. Trust that truth does not require constant defense. Trust that those who are capable of understanding will not need exhaustive explanation, and those who are not will never be convinced by words alone. Wholeness recognizes this and releases the compulsion to persuade. This does not mean the healed individual never speaks. It means speech is no longer driven by anxiety. When they speak, it is measured. It carries weight. Their words are fewer, but more grounded. They do not over-qualify or justify. They state and allow the response to belong to the other. Silence also marks the end of internal conflict. The mind no longer argues with itself about who it should be. There is less inner commentary, less self-surveillance. The psyche becomes quieter because it is no longer divided. What once needed constant explanation internally has been integrated. In this sense, silence is not withdrawal from life, but a deeper participation in it. It reflects an inner alignment so stable that it does not require performance. The individual can sit in stillness without feeling empty. They can be alone without feeling abandoned. They can be misunderstood without feeling erased. Silence becomes the natural state of a self that knows itself and no longer needs to announce its existence